So there's a ton to talk about with this episode, but the thing that sticks with me the most is a question that I've been asking since 2009. At what point did Vulcans decide that floor pods were the most logical educational tool? Seriously, kids had to be killing themselves all the time tripping into those damn things. How is that logical? Sarek's teachings or some nonsense. Hey there, dudes. I hope you're all doing well, having a happy new year so far, and holding your tribbles close and your ractogenos closer. Speaking of 2024 though, this year will mark the premiere of the final season of Star Trek Discovery coming this April, which, in many ways, to me as a Trekkie, feels like the end of an era. When Discovery premiered back in 2017, which is a wild statement to say, it marked the return of Star Trek to an episodic television-style format that had formally ended with the cancellation of Star Trek Enterprise back in 2005 with its, let's say, disappointing finale, or if you're like me, an excellent finale followed by a weird TNG episode that I'd just rather forget. But either way, itself was the end of a nearly 20-year era of uninterrupted Star Trek series, an unheard of precedent both at the time and still to this day. Despite the 3 mostly well-received Kelvin timeline movies being released between the 2 series, Star Trek hadn't felt relevant for years, and Discovery hoped to change that. But over the years, Discovery has earned an interesting reputation among Trekkies. It returned Trek to its hour-long format, but also brought Trek into the streaming peak TV era, defined by extremely serialized storytelling that Enterprise and Deep Space Nine before it had dabbled in to varying degrees, but had never really fully committed to. Discovery also arguably began, or at least was at the start of, the blockbusterization, high-stakes franchise sci-fi TV trend that we now see being continued with Star Wars and Marvel. The series also kept J.J. Abrams' Kelvin films' divisive, more kinetic, and lens flare visual style. On top of this, Discovery also perpetuated the franchise's frustrating prequel and nostalgia setting that had begun with Enterprise that the franchise still has yet to escape entirely. At the same time, Discovery had a boldness to it, a willingness to try new things with Star Trek, for better or worse, from its darker story in its earlier seasons to bringing Trek's sometimes tokenistic representation to a more inclusive feeling. It also set off a massive resurgence for the franchise with direct spin-offs like Strange New Worlds and the upcoming Starfleet Academy, and it also set the stage for shows like Lower Decks, Prodigy, and Picard. And Discovery has done all of this while enduring some of the most intense scrutiny and criticism, both legitimate and some, let's just say, disingenuous, from the Trekkie community. Which, if you know anything about the Star Trek fandom, is saying something. Discovery is also a show that is near and dear to my heart for many reasons. It brought Star Trek back from the dead, allowed me to see myself as a trans and queer person in my favorite franchise, and allowed me to find a modern-day Trekkie community that not only has brought me so much joy, but been foundational to my own professional and creative career on YouTube and elsewhere. Without Discovery, I wouldn't have met some of my best friends and professional collaborators like Dr. Aaron McDonald, for example. And while I've been discussing all of Star Trek, including Discovery, on my main channel and here on my secondary one for several years now, I've never actually gone back and rewatched and reviewed Discovery from the beginning, having started reviewing it on my main channel during its 2nd season. Dear heavens, look at how much of a baby trans I was back then. Aw, you're just standing in front of your shelf like a little nerd. I lost the shelf. It's over there now. I've grown! And while I've rewatched season 1 episodes here and there for larger videos, I haven't actually just sat back to truly analyze it on its own terms, without the bias of it being new, nor the hyperbole of online discourse informing my thoughts. So, in preparation for Discovery's end, I'm going to be reviewing every episode week to week of season 1 of Discovery here on this channel. And I hope you'll enjoy me looking back at a show that I love and love to critique before it finally finishes. And if these season 1 videos do well, I might even continue into season 2 and other modern Star Trek shows. But let's not get ahead of ourselves and turn into sex salamanders, and let's start with Star Trek Discovery's 2-part pilot episodes, The Vulcan Hello and Battle of the Binary Stars. Since it's a pilot and a new beginning for the franchise, the first thing we've got to discuss about these pair of episodes is its aesthetic, cause whoo boy, that is contentious, especially when it was released. Despite being a prequel, Discovery has, right from its first scenes, an extremely distinct look, one that many vocal Trekkies seem to hate given how drastic a departure it is from the very bright candy-colored visual style of Trek's past, especially of the Trek of the 1960s that Discovery was ostensibly set within the same era as. That said, on its own terms, and ignoring what Discovery does in later seasons, I actually adore this pilot's look. Yes, the sets, costumes, and props all feel different, yet they still have a distinct Starfleet look to them. The Shenzhou is clearly a Starfleet ship with its protruding nacelles and saucer shape, yet its more metallic tone gives it a sense of realism that didn't exist before, even in the Kelvin movies. The same goes for the main Klingon ship that we see in this episode. The fact that it is a mausoleum of the dead gives it a haunting, eerie quality that we've never had before with the Klingons, but works well and gives them an air of mystique while still echoing the TOS movie era Klingon ship looks. Also, despite many people arguing that Discovery doesn't recognize canon, to me, the blue uniforms and even the chunky spacesuit Burnham wears with its gold bodysuit leggings feels like an interesting middle ground between the bulkier NASA-inspired costumes of the prequel Star Trek Enterprise and the more casual look of the original series, actually connecting the dots in the franchise rather nicely. Georgiou's office is a fantastic set as well, with some beautiful little character pieces like her telescope that give flavor despite these starker surroundings. I think perhaps the element that I like the least is the bridge of the Shenzhou, which is similar to the bridge of the Discovery that will come in Season 3. While the bridge evolves the subnautical look of Star Trek Enterprise while expanding to the open space sensibility reminiscent of Star Trek The Next Generation and Voyager's bridges, it also has the least inviting feeling bridge of a Star Trek show ever. Everything feels utilitarian, cold, distant, and without personality to distinguish it from other sci-fi shows at the time. To a degree, this fits the vibe of the rest of the season with its darker war and trauma themes that we will take advantage of, but in this pilot that's trying to evoke a more Star Trekian place for our characters to begin their arcs from, it just feels distancing and militaristic. In contrast, though, the cinematography is full of life. While J.J. Abrams' constantly moving and spinning cameras and lens flares have been critiqued to death, I think it gives Star Trek a flair and uniqueness that frankly so many other big sci-fi franchises lack. Honestly, in the era that we're now in, full of bland, paint-by-the-numbers cinematography with modern blockbusters, the vibrancy and distinct feeling of Star Trek that this cinematography gives is refreshing, and on top of that, feels very purposefully done throughout this pilot. Take this shot of Burnham staring out the Shenzhou's bridge, or this editing cut between Georgiou and Burnham. It makes you feel like you're in unknown territory, out in space, floating around, yet still draws you into the human beings at the center of the story, as all Star Trek shows should do. I do think Discovery, in future episodes, will lose that intentionality of the camera, but this pilot used it well. Also, despite the show not being as heavily saturated as past Treks, this pilot is still beautiful, using an exquisite yet limited palette of yellow, gold, silver, and blue in the lighting, sets, and costumes that stands out. But the real reason that Discovery's look was so divisive is that this series is set so close in the timeline to the 1960s series 23rd Century, and how drastic it is in a departure from that visual look. It sets itself up to fail with that comparison. It would have been less of a sticking point if this show had been set in an era we hadn't seen before, as The Next Generation, with its 1980s wood panel and carpets, did for itself by setting it 100 years after Kirk. I mean, we're Trekkies, we still would have complained, but I think most would have gotten over it faster and it been less of a weapon for the #NotRealStarTrek crowd to use if it hadn't been a prequel. And while that doesn't bother me personally at all, the boldness of the departure while still being tied to the franchise's past really does it in. I think this, coupled with things like Burnham being a previously unknown adoptive sister of Spock and having Sarek appear via his special mind meld connection to Burnham that even Spock didn't have, feels like Discovery not fully trusting its voice and anxiously attempting to justify itself as a Star Trek series by adding in shallow signifiers of that franchise that often distract from its bolder choices instead of bolstering them, even despite James Frain's excellent performance. Thankfully, later seasons of Discovery would justify and move away from these issues, but rewatching, you can see someone, probably a studio executive, saying, "But we need Spock 'cause it's Star Trek," to the room full of writers trying to do something new. This brings us, however, to the pilot's most contentious choice, the Klingons. Again, many fans hate these Klingons for how different they look from past Trek Klingons, especially the loss of their vibrant hair that would return in Season 2 after the producers heard the critiques. But personally, as someone who knows the Klingons' look has constantly changed over the decades, and who has never been a huge Klingon fan enough to hold them precious, I'm less bothered by the look, but also not in love with it either. The creature design on them looks striking, yet still recognizably Klingon, and dear God, their costumes are so freaking good. I mean, what the fuck is going on with L'Rell's outfit there? But I think their Achilles heel is in how much the prosthetic limits the actors, locking their chins in so that every actor has to speak like this in a very stilted way. It's like they're Admiral Akbar.
Proceed with the countdown.
This, to a degree, gives them a Shakespearean quality that fits the Klingons. I mean, it feels like we're watching Macbeth in the original Klingon, but it also limits the actor's ability to emote. The best creature makeups limit the actor's physicality in a way that they can lean into to find and augment their character rather than ultimately hindering them from acting overall. For example, Quark actor Armin Shimmerman talks about how he found the voice of his famous Ferengi specifically through the teeth prosthetics that he had to wear. Sadly, we don't really get that with the Klingons, they're just limiting. We do, however, get that with Saru, who is played fantastically by the master creature actor Doug Jones. He is such a get for Star Trek, both as an actor and a human being, and the few moments he gets to shine in this episode are great. I also should say, every time I see Doug Jones at a convention, he is always hugging somebody, because he's just like the sweetest human. And Doug Jones makes the Kelpian Saru, even in small moments, feel like a living, breathing creature, with his tall stature, arched backwards back, and swaying arms. He's able to deliver a complete performance even in the small bits we get to see him here in this pilot, and is creature artist Neville Page's best work in probably all of Star Trek Discovery. Speaking of acting though, dear God, is everyone in this pilot amazing. Michelle Yeoh is always a treasure, giving a warm mentor-like energy to Captain Georgiou, so much so that it still angers me that this version of the character didn't stick around for long. She instantaneously feels like a classic Trek captain who, if given a chance, could have rivaled Pike or Picard as the model captain of a Starfleet ship. But the real standout is Sonequa Martin Green, who gives a truly nuanced performance as Burnham. From the moment she comes on screen, Martin Green embodies Burnham, especially in this early era of the character. While the series itself hadn't given us her entire backstory yet, Burnham already showcases the Vulcan-like rigidity and stiffness of her upbringing that is peppered with moments of human emotion leaking through it, such as her awe at looking at the Klingon probe or the binary stars, or the evident care she has for her captain. It's so subtly done in how she holds herself and performs her line, and her writing reflects this well. For example, this line,
"But I see what they meant. This is Burnham in the blind. I'm above the object, which is old. Centuries old. It's difficult to tell if it was constructed or carved. The only word to effectively describe it is wow."
is such an excellent mixture of Vulcan-like cadence and scientific analysis mixed in with human curiosity and wonder. Burnham also has a well-done, professional, yet contentious relationship with Saru that comes out in both of their performances. While I think later episodes would overplay that rivalry, thus leading to the slightly hyperbolic criticism that everyone on Discovery hates each other, it fits her in this episode and reminds me of the professional rivalries of folks like Riker and Shelby in Best of Both Worlds, or the unfulfilled dramatic potential of early Chakotay-Tom Paris interactions on Star Trek Voyager. But all of this brings us to the pilot's actual plot, which requires some outside context to fully examine. There was a lot of behind-the-scenes turmoil on Discovery before it even started, much of which we still don't know, leading to things like creator Brian Fuller leaving the series. The later removal of showrunners Aaron Herberts and Gretchen Berg during Season 2 over alleged staff abuse also signals perhaps deeper issues that were going on even in Season 1. However, one clear thing that we do know is that the story of Season 1 of Disco changed a lot, with rumors of things like Fuller wanting the series to be an anthology show. We also know that the series initially had a 13-episode order that was then expanded to 15 after most of the production was completed. While this hasn't been confirmed, most believe that those 2 episodes were used to create the 2-part pilot, with many of these scenes initially having been interspersed as flashbacks throughout season 1 to slowly reveal Burnham's backstory over the course of the season and the reason the Klingon War started, rather than front-loading us with all of that information. While that is speculative, it does fit given Burnham's entrance as a prisoner in episode 3 feels like a reintroduction of the character whose abrasiveness and standoff nature at that time would have been revealed to be a facade hiding darker traumas reflecting the season's overall themes, and also allow her character arc to have a much different trajectory over the course of that season as we come to understand her differently. On top of this, the fact that the Klingon scenes are so separated from the Shenzous on a completely different sets also feels like they were added in to fill the time out to a full episode after most of the Starfleet scenes were filmed at another time. All this goes to say that while this pilot works well on its own then, it feels distinctly separate from the rest of the series that comes after, especially season 1, and honestly takes us on a peculiar character arc for Burnham because just as we're getting to know her and like her in these episodes, she is immediately placed into a situation where she is acting in a way that is unbecoming of the type of Starfleet officer that we have been used to for over 50 years of storytelling at that point. All of it comes out of understandable places for her character, her trauma and fear at seeing the Klingons, the source of her childhood trauma, coming back in this episode. This is a great character arc, but it's told to us in a very strange way. It has us, as the audience, wrestling with her morality from the jump and questioning our ability to empathize fully with her, rather than let us fully integrate ourselves into her story and character and then better understand her choices later on, even if we disagree. It all just kind of muddies Burnham's character. Considering that this is the first Star Trek show to not focus on the captain or commander of the titular ship or station, and that Martin Green is the first black woman lead of a Star Trek show, makes this feel like a very unfortunate misstep that would force her character to face constant unwarranted dislike and criticism, both from people giving understandable storytelling critiques and also from outraged merchants who would use this reasonable minor criticism for their cries of wokeness as they endlessly excuse their hyper-focus on constantly criticizing black women characters and their denial of us to be able to move beyond outdated modes of storytelling and representation. That said, starting the series on these episodes does allow for a better beginning place for the season's themes of a Starfleet that was once bright and optimistic, turning darker as it deals with wartime ethical decisions. Starting us on the bridge of the Shenzhou with the optimistic Georgiou rather than the more fascistic Lorca on the Discovery allows us a brief glimpse of the optimism of Starfleet that the franchise is synonymous with before twisting it. A wise move given that the franchise had been gone for so long. All of this shows that, despite many claiming that Discovery didn't get Star Trek due to their surface level engagement with its darker subject matter despite, Deep Space Nine existing, or that Discovery's aesthetic was distinct from Trek's past, that the actual core of Star Trek's hopeful future and message is still intact in this show, and being used in a way that utilizes the franchise in ways that feels new instead of simply nostalgically retreading old ground. And while I don't think Star Trek always needs to have big space battles in it, it allows the series to start on the excellent battle scenes of the Battle of the Binary Stars, and makes them feel extremely traumatic and brutal in a way necessary for the season's themes of war to shine through. Both Starfleet and Burnham, these beacons of hope for the future, had suffered an extreme trauma. So how do you hold on to your ideals and your hope in the face of that?
We're at war. You should be on the bridge.
I can't help. I'm locked up for mutiny.
Why are we fighting?
It's a perfect set of themes to begin with, especially for a franchise built on the American idealism of the 60s and 80s that often highlighted high-minded ideals of inclusion, but often fell prey to the biases and oft unquestioned prejudices of a society built on colonialism and systemic injustice. The Klingon sections of the pilot also fit this well. Clearly, given the post-2016 American election time period in which this show was written, the Klingons are meant to evoke the supremacist, ethno-state, and militant accelerationist rhetoric of the, at the time, still fringe, but growing mainstream influence of the alt-right. While this allegory isn't perfect, given the Klingons are an exterior threat to the Federation rather than an internal one, T'Kuvma's racial purity rhetoric and fear of a truly inclusive, diverse society that respects difference, and his ability to galvanize the larger Klingon society through violence and martyrdom in a fascistic cult of the hero style move, feels realistic. Saru also showcases Trek's ability for an alien metaphor to underscore a show's themes. I used to make fun of the scene where Saru says,
"We were biologically determined for one purpose and one purpose alone: to sense the coming of death. I sense it coming now."
As at the time, I thought he meant he literally could sense death like a psychic, though, to be fair, Star Trek has never shied away from the mystical elements like Troy's telepathy or mind melds. Hell, Sarek's ethereal mind meld chat with Burnham in this episode is the exact kind of Trek nonsense that I love, given that Star Trek has never been hard sci-fi like The Expanse is. But rewatching the scene, it's more about his desire to act out of fear rather than hope. It brings to mind the idea of how dangerous it is to only view interactions as oppressor and oppressed as Saru does, rather than in a more holistically humanizing way. Saru sees himself as constant prey, and the Klingons see themselves as constant predator, and it's Starfleet's ability to disrupt this power dichotomy through radical inclusiveness that lends Star Trek its powerful message. Again, it's a great starting theme for the series, and one that I spoke more about in my recent Starfield and science fiction video on my main channel, and how it links up to things like anti-colonial and anti-capitalist discussions. The same goes for Burnham, who lets her trauma guide her throughout the episode. However, this is again where things get muddled, as Burnham is actually correct. Her argument is that we should have fired at the Klingons first. You do punch a Nazi to show them how weak they are. Given that the series wants to play with the idea that Burnham's mutiny is a fear-based trauma choice that she later regrets because it causes the Klingon War, it leads the episode to work at cross purposes with Burnham's character arc and will be a problem that will get even further muddled as the season's storyline progresses. The rest of the season treats Burnham's mutiny here as the entire reason that the Klingon War started, yet that's not actually really the case given what we see in the events of these episodes. Despite Burnham's mutiny, Georgiou is still able to send and offer a peace to the Klingons, which T'Kuvma then uses to galvanize a violent fear-based response from in his fringe cult, via his racial and cultural purity nostalgia make the Klingon Empire great again sermonizing. It's clear Burnham's option would have worked much better, and thereby the series blaming Burnham for the rest of the season makes no sense. Either the show would have had to make Burnham's choice be more clearly the instigation for the Klingon War, or it should have been shown that she was a scapegoat for Starfleet that Burnham herself even buys into, considering she betrayed her captain. Yet neither of those things are done in future episodes. Again, it's not a problem of this pilot, but one that will lead to problems down the line. It makes me wonder if the reason that Burnham mutinied was changed in order to make these more cohesive two-part episodes within itself, but wasn't really thought out in terms of how it affected the entire season. Again, while Burnham's characterization is on point, the missteps in the handling of her within the plot screwed that character over right from the start, digging a hole that the show would have to take many episodes and even seasons to get her out of. In the end, this is a genuinely excellent pilot on many levels that I think, at its core, shows a boldness that Star Trek had lost for a long time. Star Trek should be a franchise where risk is its business, and yet, even now, several years after this episode aired, they still feel refreshing. These episodes also clearly show a love for and desire to say something with the Star Trek franchise rather than simply retelling these same stories that it had already told or using the Star Trek franchise to tell something it wasn't suited for. This is a lesson that I wish more genre series, both in Star Trek and outside of it, would have followed the example of after this point. However, sadly, these episodes' few mistakes, like its fear of moving entirely away from nostalgia, or its muddled character arc for its main character, would get amplified over time and hyper-focused on by both critics and Star Trek itself. But, on its own terms, this is a strong, bold, yet flawed start to a strong, bold, yet flawed series. That's my review for the two-part pilot of Star Trek Discovery, The Vulcan Hello, and the Battle of the Binary Stars, but what did you think about it? I'd love to hear all your thoughts below. Also, as you can see, this video was a little bit more higher effort than I usually do on this channel, Jessie Gender After Dark. I'm trying to maybe do something new this year where I try to put a little bit more effort into my After Dark content from time to time, and leaving my main channel for the more video essay style stuff, but allowing this channel to let me play with some ideas or styles that I may think are a little bit different or may not do as well in the algorithm, but I still want to try. So if you like this video and would like to do more of these style reviews or would like to see more scripted or a little bit more higher effort content on this channel, please share the video, like it, leave a comment. If you want to support me overall and allowing me to pay my bills, please consider helping me out over on Patreon. That really does mean a lot because I could use that. It's been kind of rough financially for a myriad of different reasons. But on top of that, even if you can't, don't forget to subscribe to this channel or my main channel. But beyond all of that, I hope you are all taking care of yourselves, and I hope you all live long and prosper.